Welcome to the Culture Lab.
Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm Kyla Ronellenfitsch.
And I'm Gabe Roche. This week in the lab, the data's back and results are in.
Financial disclosures.
Received.
Conservatives.
Making it rain.
Under the microscope today, our loaded question: how does a party spend $100 million?
We speak to Stuart Benson, journalist at the Hill Times, about the federal party's 2025 returns and what the parties have to show for their combined $170 million in spending last year. But first, this week's trend line. What do we make of the horse race this week?
I think we've officially entered a summer lull. All the pollsters must be, at Stampede or, I don't know, at Blues Fest. I guess that hasn't started yet. But we have only one new poll since we reported last week, and the aggregate numbers from 338 Canada are steady at 45% for the Liberals, 35% for the Conservatives, 10% for the NDP, and 6% for the Bloc.
Right, but what do these numbers mean? Well, based on these numbers, if the election were held today, Philippe Fournier projects a Liberal majority of 208 seats, to the Conservatives 110, with 20 for the Bloc, 12 for the NDP, and 2 for the Greens. But so let's get on to our loaded question. How does a party spend $100 million? The deadline for the federal parties to file their 2025 returns was June 30th, and we've got a pretty good look at how most of the parties have spent their way through the last year.
Yeah, this is, like Christmas-like data for political observers, because it's one thing to understand our politics by narratives, right? Like what the media is saying about, parties' priorities, how enthusiastic their base is, and it's another thing to kind of see it laid out in black and white. And so these financial disclosures are a great source of truth. They really show, how engaged the membership is and where parties are ultimately spending their money. So in this case, the headline finding is that while the Conservatives had a huge fundraising year, they also had a historic spending year, reaching a record-breaking $100 million in spending. I could be tempted to give a hacky take that this clearly didn't buy them an election, but it did sink a prime minister and the NDP for that matter. And as they will tell you, they still received a whopping 8.1 million votes. But, is there anything in the data to explain why they didn't get over the top? Where did that money ultimately go? I think it's a really interesting source of data to answer that question.
Well, here are 3 data points that you need to know. First, 170 million. This is the combined spend of the federal parties in 2025, or at least the federal parties who have reported. This is a historic level of spending in Canada, even if it's a little cute in American terms. For example, in the California Democratic primary, a single losing candidate, billionaire Tom Steyer, spent $195 million US on advertising alone in that primary election.
Yeah, the second number is 99 million, which is, I guess, is the more precise figure of the Conservative spending. Yes. We, of course, have spending caps for the RIP period. So the overall spending for the Liberals versus Conservatives looks actually pretty similar. But the big story is the $64 million the Conservatives spent outside of the RIP.
And our third number is 0. That's the data we have in this report from the NDP because they didn't file their financials by the deadline with Elections Canada, or Elections Canada hasn't posted the financials. We don't have any data from the NDP, so if you don't hear much about them in this episode, that is why.
Yeah, we are very much looking forward to digging into these numbers with Stuart Benson. Who's raising money, how much, and where did the money go? That is coming up next. Stuart, welcome to the Culture Lab.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Before we look into kind of the specific numbers that your article surfaced, can you give us just kind of a snapshot of the big picture? What kind of financial position were the parties in as they kicked off this year?
Well, I mean, the big picture is when they kicked off the start of this year is the I mean, if we're just looking at revenue over expenses, the Liberals surprisingly ran a surplus. Conservatives ran a bit of a sizable deficit, depending on how you look at it, which I guess ironic depending on who you ask. But I mean obviously the big number is the $100 million last year. Don't know what the NDP's financials look like just yet. I was frantically refreshing Elections Canada this
Right.
morning, hoping I'd have some breaking news for you. But that I think will be very interesting to see where what the sort of path back to uh, for the NDP is from there, because I think they didn't do too bad financially in fundraising last year, but just want to see how much they spent. It will be very interesting. And then again, I like the other number that jumps out is just so much advertising spending.
Right.
Mhm.
But I mean, they all seem to be in pretty decent financial position. I mean, the Conservatives had a bunch of money in the bank to
Yeah.
begin last year, so they're not hurting despite the top line numbers.
Well, you teased this a little bit, and your headline really centered the Conservatives' record-breaking year in terms
Hmm.
of both fundraising and spending. What was the Conservative story of 2025?
It was, I mean, that first 3 months of uh of 2025, the like when you look back at the I think seismic is I think a good word of the
Hmm.
shift in just the polling,
Yeah.
the fundraising numbers when Carney shows up. Like he raised, I think, $5 million just in his leadership campaign.
Right.
I did another story on that. There's a lot of billionaires and bankers in there. And it's just like the story is just sort of this kind of, I mean, it's in everything. It's just this seismic flip of uh, financial positioning, polling position, just kind of the public's view of the two parties. So I mean, money is, I guess, the lifeblood of politics. So the trends there, I mean, very similarly match, I guess, a lot of the stuff in uh, like the polling. The joke I made, like in the first quarter of 2025, I literally had to make my chart bigger to
Mm.
fit the $28 million
Yeah.
the Conservatives brought in that quarter. It
Mm.
was like that's larger than I think even the Conservatives would sometimes bring in an entire year. This was a there was some big bets being put down that the Conservatives were going to win and win big, and they really tried to spend as much money. Um, but the other part is that the like even with all of the money they were spending, like they could only spend 35 million during the writ period.
Yeah.
Like there's a limit on that. So that leaves, I mean, nearly I think like what 50 million? No, no, way more than that. Like almost like
60
yeah, like
something.
$63 million spent outside of the election, and
Right.
most of that on advertising. It's
Yeah.
nuts.
Uh, yeah, that fundraising piece that you talked about for Q1, it was very stunning to me. Obviously, that didn't capture campaign's own
Hmm.
fundraising, but usually you expect a leadership race to be a huge boon for the party that is having the leadership race,
Hmm.
right? And it sort of seemed like in the data that it was doing both things. Like the Conservatives more than doubled the fundraising of the Liberals in that Q1.
Yes, and there was probably a sense of like from the conservative donor side, like they could maybe sense the ground shifting a little bit. So they're like, well, we got it's all or nothing now. And that I
Yeah.
think was the sort of the spending fundraising ethos for the conservatives was just like we're on the 5 yard line. We got to put like leave everything on the field. And they I think spent left 110% or more on the field in terms of spending.
Right. And you really outline the difference between the in writ spending
Hmm.
versus out of the writ for the Conservatives. Were you able to glean in the data of when they were spending that money, like what that looked like for kind of the year?
pretty difficult to sort of like glean that, because there's no time frame for data, so
Yeah.
for when the spending is. So we just know when, like, they spent 35 million of it in, and how much of each fraction. And I would probably imagine there was a bit of a downturn, especially in the advertising spend after the election, though there was still a decent amount of spend, if you'll remember, because that was still a minority government, and it could have fallen. People didn't know there's in the run up to the budget, particularly, and over the summer. I'd have to go back, but I think the Conservatives did drop some advertising money.
Mhm.
There is one of the things I didn't get to, um, in terms of advertising. The Liberals have started now, rather than running Liberal ads, they're running Government of Canada ads.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that doesn't show up there in the sort of Liberal advertising, because they're government ads, even though they're very similar sort of phraseology as what was
Yeah, I
the
mean, I think
Liberals ran on.
that's a great and important point. Is, we kind of compare the parties as if they're apples to apples, but of
Hmm.
course, in lots of ways they aren't. That extends into the research budget as well. The Liberals have, government
Hmm.
research to go off of, and all of those things.
There's a digital divide in this country that our presenting sponsor, TELUS, is working hard to narrow by building out service across Canada. Last week, I talked about how important connectivity is, access to high-speed internet for rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. Healthcare, education, job opportunities, government services, so much of life happens online. TELUS likes to say that they're always building Canada. They didn't choose the word always by chance. To date, 239 Indigenous communities are serviced by TELUS. Almost 250,000 people in those communities have access to TELUS's advanced broadband networks. 1,953 Indigenous lands are enabled with TELUS LTE mobility. And over 23,000 kilometers of highway are made safer by their mobile coverage. In 2025 alone, TELUS expanded broadband networks to 50 Indigenous lands, far exceeding their target of connecting 20 Indigenous lands. TELUS knows this continued investment to bridge the connectivity gap is needed. According to the latest CRTC data, 97.1% of Canadians have access to 50/10 megabits per second unlimited internet coverage. But if you live in a rural area, the number drops to 86.1%. For First Nations reserves, it's 69.3%. That is what I mean by digital divide. Same story for mobile. 99.5% of Canadians have access to at least LTE coverage. That number drops to 97.6% if you live in a rural area. On First Nations reserves, it's only 89%, and only 86.7% of our roads and highways even have mobile coverage. Bridging these divides is a priority for TELUS, so we can all succeed, feel safe, and get the support we need, no matter who we are, where we live, or happen to be on a map. That's why their investments in connectivity will continue. They have to.
You had mentioned kind of at the outset the dramatic change in what we saw in the polling
Hmm.
for the Liberals. How did that translate into their financial footing throughout the year?
Well, because that was so obviously the conservative fundraising machine. Like, when Polyev showed up, he turned it into like the Pacific Rim robot, like with rockets, and it was smashing all records. And then it's like you have this huge, and you obviously have this huge gap, especially in Q1 of 2025. But as the year went on, I mean, there's a post-election dip in fundraising, but the Liberals are getting real close. Um, like, there's the one graph I have down there. I think it was the quarter, so Q4 of 2026. There was maybe I think less than a $500,000 differential between what the
Right.
Conservatives brought in that quarter and what the Liberals brought in. So the conservative sort of floor is lowering, but sort of returning to the mean more, because like 2024 into 2025, we got huge numbers. But $9 million in Q1 of this year is right around like the sort of floor that Polyev had as soon as he came in as
Right.
leader.
And
So, oh, sorry.
is that fundraising strength, is that part of the Trudeau legacy? Like, have they figured out something? Like, can you see that in the tracking and in the data, or is this a Mark Carney thing
I
that
think this is a Mark Carney thing because
okay.
obviously the Conservatives are beating out the Liberals still in total fundraising numbers, but in individual contributions, and I have to say contributions because it's not contributors, like because you can have multiple people listed
Yeah.
in a single thing donating multiple times. But in terms of total contributions, individual contributions, I believe in Q1 of 2025 or Q1 of 2025, I think the Liberals had more individual contributions, and that you've seen that those numbers tick up in overall like individual contributions. For the Liberals, where I believe in Q4, like they're so yeah, no, in Q4 2021-25, Liberals had 156 individual contributions, and the Conservatives had 148.
Right.
So the Conservatives obviously are getting larger numbers in each per contribution, but the Liberals are getting a lot of them. It's I forget what the average. I can actually pull that up. I have a graph for everything. So in 2025, averaged.
A man speaking to our hearts on this
Absolutely.
podcast.
If you
Absolutely.
pick a quarter and a year in the past since 2015, and I can give you the how much they got.
Oh,
And
beautiful.
yeah, but like so last year, average donation across the board for 4 quarters so they brought in 47 million last year plus transfers and stuff, and then about 327,000 ish contributions for an average donation of 146. The Liberals was $76. NDP was
Right.
about 52 and they brought in 6.2, and obviously the Liberals brought in around 29 million. So, and even like this last year, the per like dollar spent on fundraising per dollar back, the Conservatives spent about or brought in about $6.54 per every dollar spent on fundraising. The Liberals brought in $6.68. So it's
Right.
just it's getting to a point where it's just like it's on the inches. Like they're just sort of
Yeah.
doing some like Moneyball fundraising tactics. Like you can't beat their total fundraising, but like you can sort of edge past it on the margins.
Right. We talked a lot about their different approaches to spending, particularly related to advertising, especially that, I think within the campaign, it doesn't look that different, but the outside of the writ looks extremely different for the two parties. Was there anything else that stood out to you in terms of spending priorities? For example, I noticed some pretty big differences around like research spending or around spending on professional services that the Liberals seem to be spending a lot more on both of those fronts. Anything else that stands out in terms of their priorities?
I mean, this probably won't feed into the narrative on Carney and his flights, but the Liberals spent nearly twice as much on travel and hospitality last year than the Conservatives did. I don't know. I mean, I don't know where they're staying. I do know that it was very fun during Carney's leadership, just going through all the stuff they were expensing, and just a lot of them were sort of like parties and stuff, or like getting like $60 Uber Eats, which is like, was that 2 staffers sort of thing at this point? I mean, one thing that did pop out, I mean, in terms of like advertising spend, the Conservatives went real hard on TV, spending, I think, almost more than twice as much on TV they had, and a little bit more on radio. During the election, though, I thought what was kind of interesting was the Liberals spent twice as much on radio during the election, which jumped out. And then I was like, well, who do I know who listens to a lot of radio, whether terrestrial or satellite? And it's like the first one that pops in my head is my 60-year-old dad, which then it sort of clicks into place. It's like, oh, you're targeting sort of that sort of the boomers, as it were. So that sort of stuff pops out, like, and just I think there's a good, just the amount of advertising also was spent outside of the writ. Like the Liberals barely spent almost anything outside of the writ, whereas the Conservatives were spending, I think, they spent like not 8 million on TV advertising during the writ, but in total spent like I think it was 22 million. Yeah, 22.1 million. So that's 13 million dollars outside of the election on advertising. Um, and obviously I had the numbers on like the how much they spent pre-writ, and they were like crank that up just on Meta, like
Right.
advertising, which is the only one we can really find getting
Yeah.
publicized.
You touched a little bit on the NDP numbers, or I guess
Mm-hmm.
the lack of numbers. Is there anything that I guess, should read into that their lack of disclosure? But I know that they also do have
Mm-hmm.
there is some information on campaign spending, just not for the year. What did we learn about the NDP?
Well, in fairness, I did reach out to Elections Canada, and they said like obviously because of the like they the numbers were due on like June 30th, and then it's Canada Day, so like
Right.
apparently a bunch of people at Elections Canada were on vacation, so the numbers were
Oh,
slow
okay.
to get uploaded. So I will give. So we don't. I don't want to read anything nefarious or concerning into the lack of numbers just yet. Um, I mean, they're sort of bringing in. I mean, they also had a leadership campaign, so that those numbers will from Avi Lewis. I think he raised about $1 million if I'm remembering correctly. So that'll boost them up. And in like the first uh, quarter of this year, they brought in about 1.6 million, which
Okay.
is only about $200,000 less than they brought in the first quarter of 2025. So, and there's been a significant drop off for all of the other parties. Like they all brought in, I mean, Liberals brought in half of what they brought in last quarter. They brought in not 6.8, and last year it was 13.
There's a lot of data in these financial disclosures, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not perhaps like perfectly granular. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what is kind of obscured in the data. Like what do you wish that you could dig into more, and the kinds of questions you wish you could answer?
Well, one, like the first question you said was like the sort of the time of like when some
Yeah.
of these purchases. So like when you're going through like I think they're in some cases you can find more like granular and like when donations came in and stuff. So that would be interesting. It would be
Hmm.
interesting if I could see how much was spent after the election.
Yeah.
Um, Obviously, like what do you mean by professional services? That could be anything. There's also like other, just other,
Yeah.
which is like give me like there's obviously there's some notes in that, but it's like it is sort of like you start going through it and it's like what is like I would like to, like obviously they're not going to give me an itemized bill, but I'd love to see it. Um, and then
You
all yeah.
and that Uber Eats bill.
Yes, yeah. Like, what did you buy? What are you like? What was the snacks? Yeah, and then like just sort of like when it says like there's other advertising, they'll say like online. I'd like to know. I would be cool to know where like which like sort of platforms, which
Hmm.
websites that sort of digital advertising was on.
Yeah.
Obviously, like I said, Meta Ad Library is like one of the few sources we have that tells you how much is being spent and when. Though even that's kind of finicky.
Take it away, Gabe.
All right, I wanted to look at these numbers a little bit and think if we can kind of infer something about the tactical priorities
Mm-hmm.
that the different parties have. So obviously, the headline number 2/3 about of campaign spending went to advertising for the Liberals, Conservatives, NDP, and the Bloc.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at those advertising numbers, what would you say is kind of the current state of campaign advertising? Where are campaigns spending their money when it comes to advertising? And does it look different for the different parties?
Um, yes. So I mean, one of the big things is TV's still king. That's like we're
Mm-hmm.
obviously that's where all of the advertising is still going. I think that one of the things we can look at is just when they're obviously putting the ads out. The Liberals, because they obviously have they bring in less money. It's a lot about conserve and then just go
Hmm.
like drop everything you've saved up for the
Yeah.
election. Because like obviously there's like they both spent about 60%. I think it was like 62 for the Liberals and 64 for the Conservatives, somewhere around that for how much of their total campaign expenses they were allowed to spend that they allocated to advertising. But then outside of the election, I mean, the Liberals barely spent anything. So I think that's one of the main ones. Obviously, like digital advertising is growing very quickly. They both took out, I think, a pretty big loan. That's one of the other ones I think that I didn't get to. Like it was about the Conservatives have about $12 million in loan left to pay off. I think the Liberals, I think it's about $3 million. So they both, even with the amount the Conservatives had brought in, they still took out the full size loan.
We've referenced this kind of graphic that you put together looking at the spend with Meta on kind of a weekly basis. And if our listeners and viewers haven't seen that, strongly recommend checking that out at the Hill Times, because it's like an animated graph, and you can see how the spend is changing over time. But rather than me describe it in kind of these vague terms, do you want to give us like sort of your summary of what that graph is showing?
Well, so yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there that you almost see that sort of the way it's split. So that is combined between the advertising that's on the official parties page and the leaders. So last fall, obviously, the Conservatives were spending big on sort of both pages, on Poilievre and the party's page, and the Conservatives were spending a sort of nominal amount into that. And you can sort of see, like, it's the way it's animated is sort of like a horse race. So you can see it's very slow for the Liberals, and then you sort of get into December, and they just start, like it starts to gain, and then into the new year and those first 3 months, the gap really closes. And then I think that first week of the election, the Liberals dropped maybe $1 million on Meta or something. It was a crazy amount compared to what they spent previously. But the one thing that there was the major change, so the Liberals hadn't been basically advertising very much on Trudeau's page, so they were putting a little bit every week. And then into the new year, the Conservatives put all of them, they were still advertising with Poilievre's face and stuff, but it was all on the party's page, just all dumped there, almost nothing spent on Poilievre's page. And then the Liberals start spending a lot more on Carney's page, and still a fairly decent amount on their own as that increased. But it was weird to see that sort of flip where now the Conservatives are front loading the party brand, and then the Liberals were like, hey, look at our shiny new leader. So that was very interesting. I think probably explains a lot of the major like acceleration of spending into that first quarter, because that finally had something to put in the window.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Oh, it's nice to have that data kind of backing this sort of narrative with with Trudeau's out, and so now it's emphasis on a new leader, and the Conservatives have to say, well, okay, maybe we're not winning the leadership, the leader comparison anymore, and you can really see it reflected in the data. So that's very, very cool.
Yeah, and that's sort of the I think, to tie this into what Dan Arnold said or told me in the piece, is just sort of, even with all of that spending, like it wasn't the paid media advertising narrative that won the day. It was that sort of public zeitgeist that the Liberals were then just surfing. All they just had to do was make sure everyone like raised Carney's name recognition so that could ride the wave of the elbows up anti-Trump, like sort of Canadian groundswell of patriotism sort of thing. And just no matter what no matter how much the Conservatives spent, it couldn't sort of undo or like redirect that momentum.
Yeah. So another number that stood out to me was this sort of difference in spending on like direct voter contact. We have parties that talk a lot about knocking on doors, engaging volunteers, direct voter contact in that way, and efforts to get out the vote.
So for voter contact calling services during the election, it was about 2.5 million. And I guess the Conservatives account for about half of that. And then for election research and surveys, 2 million. And the Liberals account for half of that.
Interesting. So during the writ, the Liberal spending on polling was high. I guess the Conservatives maybe collected all the data they needed to know beforehand. All right. Well, this is lots of numbers here. Encourage everyone listening to go check out the piece. But maybe, Stuart, I'll ask you the kind of final question that we ask all of our guests. What is, and particularly pertinent today, since we're talking about so much data, but what's a source of data on our politics and political culture that you read or follow that you think our listeners should be following too?
Well, I'll just shout out Elections Canada. I know I made the joke, but they deserve their breaks too. But that's where I get all this number. If you like, obviously, I made a bunch of very colorful, fun graphs, and I would also recommend people checking out the story. But if you want to do the deep dive yourself, you want to make your own graph. All these numbers are on Elections Canada. Shout out 338 then. I'm constantly just sort of scrolling through 338. I will say Philip Fournier, it uses so much like RAM or whatever but it's a great utility. So yeah, those are
Needs
my
his own
three.
data center. Good.
Sort of, those are my like morning check-ins alongside all the little newsletters I have to read. But yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Stuart. This is a great. Thank you for the public service that you provide in putting together all this data in an analyzable way.
Thank you very
We
much.
really appreciate your time coming on the podcast.
Numbers are for the people, so I appreciate you bringing me on. Yeah, this is fun. Love chatting data and charts.
Brilliant.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. It's time for Random Sample. Gabe, what have you got this week?
Well, this week I'm looking at some data from the OECD that was profiled recently in The Economist. It's called the Survey of Adult Skills. This is a study where they've administered aptitude tests to like 160,000 adults across all the OECD countries. The Economist had the OECD filter the data so it only includes adults under the age of 35 who are in post-secondary education. They call it tertiary education technically, so university and college. Sadly, the headline from these numbers is that we are getting dumber, or rather, across the OECD, 8% of post-secondary students are no smarter, whether on literacy or numeracy, than a fifth grader, a 10-year-old child. That number has doubled over the past 10 years, and it's especially pronounced when it comes to literacy. Now, I want to be careful in some landmines in comparing across countries in data like this, but I will say that Canada is among the leaders of the pack on these numbers. So while the OECD average is 8% of people, post-secondary students performing at the level of a 10-year-old, in literacy, Canada's only at 5%. We're a little behind Germany, France, and Britain. And then on numeracy, we are at 7%. So 7% of post-secondary students performing at the level of a 10-year-old, but still, fairly high up the list, behind only Singapore, Hungary, Britain, and Portugal. The United States, where I've taught some post-secondary students, is at 13% in literacy, and unfortunately 18% in numeracy. So these are pretty grim numbers, I will say. And I'm not going to tell you whether I agree with them while the tape is rolling. But definitely a troubling trend, only likely to get worse with wider and more convenient use of AI, of course, which allows you to outsource cognitive effort and your learning to these AI models, especially in numeracy. That kind of thing is inevitable. And even though Claude is a lot smarter than a 10-year-old child, and it will allow us to kind of give the appearance of being on neuroperformance enhancing drugs, that underlying outsourcing of cognitive capacity, it doesn't bode well for when we hit our weekly usage limits.
Right.
Kyla, over to you. What have you got?
I actually have more data on the financial disclosures. I've been spending some time working on this for my Substack. So Stuart did a really great job of showing the snapshot in time that was 2025. But I really wanted to understand how campaign spending is changing from campaign to campaign, in part because I'm Snoopy, and so I want to see like the strategic priorities of different strategists, right? How does a campaign under Jenny Byrne look like versus a campaign under, I'm looking as far back as 2004. So let's say a Hurley campaign and what the spending priorities look like. So there's sort of that lens, but then there's also just how is our media and information ecosystem changing and how are the campaigns adjusting to that? So there are a few things that stood out to me that I think were pretty interesting. Both the Liberals and Conservatives showed increased prioritization of TV in the last campaign in 2019 as a portion of their overall campaign spending. So in 2019, the Liberals spent 20% of their overall budget on TV, and that was up to 24% in this last election. And the Conservatives have always been more TV dependent, spending 32% of their budget on TV in 2019 compared to 39% now. NDP TV spending collapsed from 32% in 2021 to 22% in 2025. And that budget went basically entirely online. So 41% of their campaign budget in this last election went to digital ads, up from 24% in the year before. So it really is, it's not just Charlie Angus saying that they prioritized TikTok. Like, they really did move their campaign online in a very serious way. And one last note on the block, because I think a lot of the findings are really interesting on what do campaigns with less resources do, like how, and also they have that regional component that is they're just reaching a very different audience, and they spent almost as much on radio as they did online. 20% of their budget went to digital ads compared to 17.5% for radio. So I think a pretty interesting lens into the Quebec state of affairs. So overall, just kind of a really interesting lens into the different budget realities of these campaigns. And a look at who they were, we can kind of infer who they were trying to persuade in how they're spending their money.
Very cool. Well, that is it for our show this week. A huge thanks to Stuart for joining us in the lab. We also want to send our thanks to our sponsors for helping to keep this show free for you and to you, our lab rats.
And a reminder that you can find references for the data we discussed in the show notes. And Gabe, where can the people find you?
I'm at Gabe Roche on all the platforms.
And you can find me at Ronellenfitsch on all the social mediums, and Relay with Kyla Ronellenfitsch on Substack. We will see you all again next week.
Bye-bye.
Welcome to the Culture Lab.